My cheating wife threatened to call the police if I didn't let her date her lover. The shock of those words hit me like a sharp knife piercing my flesh. How did I get to this point? The woman I loved, the woman with whom I shared dreams and promises, now stood before me, implacable, demanding that I accept her infidelity as something normal, a part of our routine. The desperation in his eyes wasn't for me, but for him, the man who, hidden in the shadows, was slowly stealing everything I thought was mine. The details of how she fell into his arms still escape me, but the poison was already deeply ingrained. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was a complete devastation of everything we had built together. Every smile, every hug, everything now seems tainted by the darkness of your lies. She looked at me with a coldness that I never imagined seeing in that familiar face. The same woman who once promised me eternity now threatened to destroy me if I didn't back down, if I didn't allow her to stay with him. The pain of betrayal is mixed with fear, not just of losing her, but of losing myself in the process. How can a man maintain his sanity when the person he trusted blindly becomes his worst enemy? The love we had now turns into a silent war, where the battlefield is the heart, and the weapons are sharp words and deafening silences. What happened to her? Or perhaps the question should be, what happened to me? Have I always been so blind, so innocent? Doubts gnaw at my mind, while the weight of reality crushes me. She looks at me, defiantly, as if she already knows the decision I will make. But what she doesn't know is that the situation is about to take a turn that no one, not even me, could predict. Should I let her go? Should I watch as the love of my life is lost to someone else? Or, who knows, is there still something I can do to reverse this? But the more I think about it, the more I realize that maybe the problem isn't what I can do, but what she's already done. And now, with the police about to get involved, what should have been a simple case of betrayal turns into something much bigger, much darker. There are secrets that have not yet been revealed, secrets that could change everything. What's really at stake? And how far is she willing to go to protect what she hides? As she walks away, I feel like this story is far from over. What I discover could very well be the end, or the beginning of something even worse. Boston was plunged into a chilly autumn afternoon. The yellowed leaves fell slowly, dancing in the wind before scattering across the sidewalks. Inside an elegant house in a leafy neighborhood, Ethan paced the living room, trying to focus on work. He was a successful lawyer, respected by his peers and admired for his impeccable ethics. However, that afternoon, the documents spread out on the table were nothing more than a blur in his mind. The only thing he could think about was the emptiness that took over his home. Lisa, his wife, was there, but at the same time she seemed so far away. They got married 7 years ago, a marriage that, in everyone's eyes, was rock solid. She was a woman of delicate beauty, with a natural charm that captivated everyone around her. She managed an art gallery, where she spent most of her days surrounded by paintings and sculptures, immersed in a creative world that Ethan always admired. But in recent months, something had changed. Lisa had become more reserved, less smiling, as if a shadow had settled in her soul. Ethan noticed the subtle signs of a changing woman, long unexplained absences, phone calls abruptly interrupted when he entered the room, texts sent and received with a frequency he couldn't ignore. The routine that was once comforting was now permeated with tension that grew day by day. One time during dinner, Ethan tried to start a conversation about how Lisa was feeling. He wanted to understand, wanted to help her overcome whatever was causing her pain. But instead of opening up, Lisa gave him a forced smile and said that everything was fine, that she was just tired because of work. He knew it was a lie, but he preferred not to pressure her at that moment. However, the restlessness did not leave him. Ethan began to observe every detail, every change in his wife. Sleepless nights began to become frequent. He would get out of bed in the middle of the night, walk through the dark house, trying to decipher the enigma that his own life had become. The walls of the house, which had once seemed welcoming, now seemed to close in on him, making the air difficult to breathe. And then, one night, the discovery. Ethan, overcome by an impulse he himself couldn't control, took Lisa's cell phone while she was sleeping. His hands shook as he unlocked the device. He felt like he was invading the privacy of the woman he loved, but the need to know the truth was greater than any qualms. And there, in the messages exchanged with an unknown number, he found the words that broke his heart. Words of affection, plans for dates, promises of a future together. All written with an intimacy that he hadn't shared with Lisa in a long time. The initial shock paralyzed him. Ethan couldn't believe his eyes. How could that be happening? He reread the messages several times, hoping that his eyes were deceiving. But the truth was there, raw and indisputable. Lisa was involved with another man. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to maintain his composure. At work, he was the same steady, focused lawyer he always was, but inside, he was falling apart. Lisa's betrayal consumed his thoughts, eating him up inside. He wanted to confront her, he wanted to demand explanations, but at the same time, he feared the answers he might hear. What would he do if she just admitted that she didn't love him anymore? One night, unable to bear the silence any longer, Ethan waited for Lisa to return from another of her nights at the gallery. When she entered the house, he was sitting on the couch, the living room lights were on. Lisa stopped in the middle of the hallway, surprised to find him there, awake. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tense. She hesitated for a moment, her tired eyes revealing that she knew exactly what he wanted to talk about. "About what?" he replied, trying to appear indifferent, but there was an obvious nervousness in his posture. "About what's going on between us," Ethan continued, getting up from the couch and approaching her. "I know you're hiding something from me, Lisa. There's no point in denying it anymore." She looked away, biting her lower lip, as she did whenever she was under pressure. The silence that followed was suffocating, filled with unspoken words. Lisa finally sighed, and, in an almost resigned tone, said, "I need some time. I don't know what I'm feeling. Maybe it's work, maybe it's our routine. I just need space." "Space?" Ethan repeated in disbelief. "Space for what? To continue with it?" Lisa didn't respond, but her expression said it all. It was the first time he spoke directly about his lover, and she didn't try to deny it. Instead, he took a step back, as if the simple act of physically moving away could keep him away from his emotions. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said finally, her voice cold. "And don't try to stop me, Ethan. I need to see him. If you try to stop me, I'll call the police." The threat hung in the air, creating an insurmountable barrier between them. Ethan felt butterflies in his stomach, a mixture of anger, hurt and helplessness. The woman he loved was willing to go so far to be with another man. How had everything deteriorated so quickly? What should he do now? The questions continued to echo in his mind, with no answer in sight. He watched as Lisa headed to her room, closing the door behind her. The sound of the lock was like an end to the conversation, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and a pain he never imagined he would feel. The silence in the house was deafening, and he knew this was just the tip of the iceberg. What came next could be even worse. As the night wore on, Ethan stood there, lost in a storm of emotions. Lisa's betrayal wasn't just a flaw in the marriage, it was an open wound that threatened to destroy everything he believed to be real. But despite everything, he couldn't let go of the hope that maybe, somehow, there was still a chance to salvage what was left of their life together. What he didn't know, however, was that the shadows of the past were about to emerge, bringing to light secrets that would transform that betrayal into something much more dangerous. The next morning arrived with a weight that seemed impossible to carry. Ethan woke up before the sun rose, the first rays of light barely beginning to illuminate the cloudy sky. He spent the night awake, reliving every detail of the conversation he had with Lisa. Her decision to go out to meet her lover was like a knife stuck in her chest. The thought of seeing her leave, perhaps never to return, was unbearable. However, He knew he needed to keep a cool head. I couldn't just watch everything fall apart without trying to understand what was really happening. The day dragged on slowly. Ethan could barely focus on anything other than Lisa's imminent departure. The clock seemed to defy time, each minute longer than the last. As she prepared to leave, he watched her every movement, searching for any sign, any hint that there was still hope. But Lisa was distant, emotionally disconnected. He dressed with almost mechanical precision, without even casting a glance in his direction. When the time finally came, she grabbed her car keys and, without saying a word, headed for the door. Ethan could no longer contain the whirlwind of emotions. He followed her to her car, the tension between them palpable. She hesitated for a moment, perhaps waiting for one last word from him, but the silence was deafening. Lisa got into the car and drove off, leaving behind a cloud of uncertainty. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, watching the car disappear around the bend. A feeling of despair mixed with anger began to wash over him. The pain of betrayal was no longer just an emotional wound, but something much deeper, which threatened to consume his sanity. He couldn't just accept the situation, he needed to act. But what to do? Following Lisa seemed like the only option. Without wasting any more time, Ethan grabbed his car keys and started following her. Traffic was light, and he managed to keep a safe distance. His heart was beating fast, and he felt like a stranger in his own life. With each kilometer covered, the tension increased, and the certainty that he was about to discover something much bigger than simple infidelity began to form in his mind. Lisa drove to a remote hotel, a discreet place that would go unnoticed by anyone. She parked the car and quickly got in, without looking back. Ethan parked across the street, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. He knew that, by walking through those doors, he could be exposing himself to truths he never wanted to know. But there was no turning back. He waited a few minutes before entering the hotel. The lobby was almost empty, with only a receptionist distracted looking at his computer screen. Ethan slipped past him unnoticed and headed for the elevator. Lisa hadn't seen him enter, and that gave her the confidence to continue. When the elevator doors closed, Ethan felt his heart speed up even more. The tension was almost unbearable, but he knew he needed to see it with his own eyes. The elevator stopped on the 6th floor. The doors slowly opened, revealing a silent, dimly lit hallway. Ethan walked forward with cautious steps, trying not to make any noise. As he approached the door he had seen Lisa enter, the muffled sounds of voices reached his ears. He stopped in front of the half-open door, fear and curiosity fighting for control of his actions. He peeked through a crack and saw Lisa inside the room, standing next to the bed, talking to someone he couldn't see. The conversation was tense, charged with emotion. Ethan forced himself to listen, and little by little he began to understand the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just a romantic date. The words exchanged between Lisa and the man in the room revealed a dark past, something he could never have imagined. Her tone of voice was low, almost pleading, while the man, firm and relentless, dictated the rules of what seemed to be a negotiation. She was trapped, not just emotionally, but in some much deeper way. The man was clearly in control, and Lisa seemed desperate to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Ethan stepped back, trying to process what he had just heard. The man in the room wasn't just a lover, he was someone from Lisa's past, someone who wielded incomprehensible power over her. The betrayal he thought he knew was just the tip of the iceberg. What he discovered in that hotel was a much more dangerous secret, one that could destroy not only their marriage, but their lives. As he walked back to the car, Ethan's mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. He knew he needed to find out more, but he also knew he was playing a dangerous game. Lisa was clearly involved in something much bigger, something she was desperate to keep hidden. And now, he was right in the middle of it. Upon arriving home, Ethan tried to remain calm, but the discovery at the hotel gave him no rest. Lisa's behavior upon returning only reinforced his suspicions. She entered the house without saying a word, her eyes avoiding his. The silence between them was heavy, but filled with hidden meanings. Lisa knew he was suspicious, but she seemed determined to keep the secret at any cost. Ethan spent the night awake again, trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. He was at a crossroads, unsure whether he should confront Lisa directly or continue investigating on his own. But what became clear to him that night was that things were about to escalate to a much more dangerous level. As the night wore on, Ethan felt his control of the situation slipping more and more through his fingers. What started as a simple suspicion of infidelity had turned into something much darker, and he knew he was approaching a revelation that could change everything. What he didn't know, however, was how far Lisa was willing to go to protect the secret she so desperately guarded. The days that followed were unbearable tension. Ethan could barely bear Lisa's presence in the house. The silence between them was suffocating, filled with unanswered questions and unspoken truths. Her every move seemed calculated, as if she was constantly on guard, waiting for the right moment to act. He watched everything, trying to decipher their intentions, but at the same time, he fought against his own anger and fear of what was to come. One cloudy afternoon, Ethan decided he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to fully understand what was happening, he needed to confront Lisa and get the truth out of her. The mystery surrounding her lover, her strange behavior, everything seemed to indicate that there was something much darker at play. The idea that Lisa was involved in something criminal no longer seemed so far away, and the thought tormented him day and night. When Lisa returned home that day, Ethan was waiting for her in the living room. He had rehearsed what he would say, but nothing could prepare him for the whirlwind of emotions he was about to face. Lisa entered, carrying a shopping bag, and froze when she saw him there, standing in the middle of the room, his eyes fixed on her. There was an intensity in Ethan's gaze that made her hesitate for a moment before composing herself. "What are you doing?" Lisa asked, trying to sound casual, but there was a tremor in her voice that didn't escape Ethan. "We need to talk," he replied, firmly. "And this time, I won't accept excuses or half-truths. I want the truth, Lisa. The whole truth." She let out a long sigh, letting her bag fall to the floor. For an instant, their eyes met, and Ethan noticed something different about her, a deep weariness, a kind of surrender he had never seen before. "Okay," she said finally, her voice lower. "But I don't know if you're ready to hear what I have to say." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, but he stood his ground. "Taunt me." Lisa slowly walked to the couch and sat down, as if the weight of what she was about to reveal was too much to bear standing up. Ethan remained standing, his eyes never leaving hers. The room seemed to shrink as the silence stretched on, every second charged with the anticipation of a revelation that could change everything. "Before we met," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I was a different person. I've done things I'm not proud of, things that, well, that you wouldn't expect from me. I met people who took me down paths I would rather forget. But there are things that just can't be buried, Ethan." Ethan felt his heart tighten in his chest. He knew he was about to hear something terrible, but part of him still clung to the hope that somehow this was all a misunderstanding. "And this man?" he asked, trying to control the tremor in his voice. "The man you're meeting, is he part of that past?" Lisa looked away, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. "Yes, he does," she admitted. "We were partners. I got involved in something dangerous, something that should never have happened. He was my contact, my accomplice. And when everything went wrong, I was the one who escaped, I was the one who left him behind to face the consequences." Ethan could hardly believe what he was hearing. The woman he loved, who he believed he knew so well, was telling him that she had been an accomplice to a crime. The weight of this revelation hit him like a blow, but he didn't allow his anger to take control. He needed more details, needed to fully understand the extent of what was happening. "And now he's back?" Ethan asked, each word coming out with difficulty. "Did he come back to blackmail you? And that?" Lisa nodded slowly, her hands shaking as she tried to maintain her composure. He found me, he continued. He said he wants his share, that he wants what he thinks is rightfully his. But that's not all, Ethan. He wants to destroy me, he wants to destroy everything we built together. And I don't know how to stop this. Ethan felt a mix of anger and compassion. Part of him wanted to scream, demand answers, ask how she could get involved in something so sordid. But another part, the part that still loved her deeply, wanted to protect her, to find a way to save her from this desperate situation. And why didn't you tell me before? He asked, his voice full of pain. Why didn't you trust me? Lisa finally looked at him, her eyes filled with regret. Because I was scared, he admitted. Afraid that you hated me, afraid of losing everything. I know I made a mistake, but believe me, I never wanted to involve you in this. I just wanted to keep you safe, keep our lives intact. Ethan didn't know what to say. Emotions overwhelmed him, and he felt torn between the love he still felt for her and the fear of what it could mean for their future. He wanted to believe that there was still a chance, that they could get through this together. But how? We need to go to the police, he said finally, making the most logical decision he could at that moment. We need to put an end to this before he can do something even worse. Lisa shook her head vigorously, her eyes wide with terror. No. He exclaimed. You don't understand, Ethan. He has proof, he has records. If the police get involved, he will ruin me, he will expose everything. And not just me, it will drag you into this mud too. The desperation in Lisa's voice hit Ethan like a wave. He knew she was telling the truth, and that only increased his fear of what could happen. What else did this man have against her? And why did Lisa seem so convinced there was no way out? So what do you suggest? Ethan asked, trying to find some kind of solution in the chaos. Are you going to continue seeing him? Keep playing his game until when? Lisa didn't have an immediate answer. She looked at the ground, her hands gripping her knees so hard her knuckles turned white. Her helplessness was palpable, and Ethan began to realize that, despite all the pain she had caused, Lisa was also suffering. She was trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. Finally, she looked up to meet Ethan's eyes, her voice low and thick with emotion. I don't know what to do, he confessed. I wish I could tell you that I have a plan, but the truth is that I'm lost. And the more I try to find a way out, the more I feel like I'm sinking. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He approached Lisa and knelt in front of her, taking her cold hands in his. We will find a solution, he said, more firmly than he actually felt. Together. But you need to trust me. You need to tell me everything. Lisa hesitated for a moment before finally nodding, letting Ethan know the whole truth. She knew she could no longer carry this burden alone, that if there was any chance of salvation, it would be through Ethan's support and love. But at the same time, she feared that the full revelation of her secrets would be the final blow to her marriage. And then, Lisa started to tell everything, from the beginning. He revealed how he had gotten involved with that man, Marco, at a time when his life was in disarray, before he met Ethan. How they had worked together on a series of financial scams, taking advantage of legal loopholes and others' trust. How, in the end, everything fell apart when one of the victims reported them, forcing her to flee, while Marco stayed behind to face the consequences. She believed she had left all that behind, but Marco found her, and now he was exacting his revenge. As the words came out, Ethan felt a mixture of horror and sadness. He knew that on some level he still loved Lisa, but the extent of the lies and omissions was devastating. What should he do now? Hand over the woman he loved to justice? Or try to find a way to protect her, even if it meant compromising his own principles? And once again, Ethan realized that the nightmare was just beginning. Now that he knew the whole truth, he was more involved than ever, and the decision he needed to make could be the most difficult of his life. The weight of the revelation caused an oppressive silence to settle in the room. Lisa had finished speaking, and now, all that was left was the stark reality that there was no going back. Their relationship, built on years of love and trust, was damaged beyond repair. Lisa's words still echoed in Ethan's mind, every detail of her dark past pulling him into an abyss he feared he couldn't escape. Ethan stood up, feeling the weight of every movement. I needed space, I needed to think. Lisa continued to sit, looking at him with a mixture of pleading and resignation. She knew that by telling the truth she risked losing everything. But at that moment, there was nothing left to hide. Ethan walked to the window and looked out, trying to find some clarity in the chaos his life had become. Outside, night was beginning to fall, and the street lights came on one by one. He felt an almost irresistible urge to leave, to get away from it all, but he knew that wouldn't solve anything. I couldn't just walk away from the situation, I needed to face it, somehow. He turned to Lisa, who was still watching him silently. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many emotions he wanted to express, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say to a woman who had destroyed his confidence but who, at the same time, was so desperate for his help? You said Marco has proof, Ethan began, his voice sounding colder than he intended. Evidence that could ruin us. What exactly does he have? Lisa lowered her head, as if Ethan's words were a physical blow. He has records, she replied, almost in a whisper. Documents, recordings, things that connect me to the crimes we committed. Things that irrefutably incriminate me. I thought I got rid of everything, but he kept it, and now he's using it against me. Ethan felt a wave of anger rise through his body. Marco wasn't just blackmailing Lisa, he was destroying any chance of reconciliation between them, destroying the life Ethan had worked so hard to build. And why did he wait so long? Ethan asked, trying to understand the logic of the cruel game Marco was playing. Why didn't he find you sooner? Lisa closed her eyes for a moment, as if reliving those details was almost unbearable. He was in prison, he said, his voice shaking. When everything went wrong, he was arrested. I managed to escape, I started my life over here. But he never forgave me for leaving him behind. Now that he's free, he wants revenge, and I'm the only thing he has to achieve that. Lisa's confession was like a final blow to Ethan. He walked away, trying to process the idea that the man Lisa was now involved with was someone she had betrayed in the past, someone who was determined to destroy her, and ultimately destroy everything they had built together. You should have told me from the beginning, Ethan finally said, his voice firm but full of pain. We could have faced this together, but now, we are in the middle of a nightmare that I don't know if we can get out of. Lisa nodded, tears starting to roll down her face. I know, she replied, her voice breaking. I know I should have told you, but I was so afraid of losing you, afraid that everything we built would fall apart. And now, I see that that's exactly what happened. Ethan sat back down, his head buried in his hands. Anger and sadness mixed into a storm he couldn't control. He wanted to blame Lisa for everything, he wanted to scream, but he knew that wouldn't change what had already been done. They were at a dead end, and the only thing he could do was try to find a way out that wouldn't completely destroy their lives. After a long silence, he finally raised his head and looked directly at Lisa. We need to be smart about this, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. If Marco wants revenge, then let's give him what he wants, but on our terms. You need to tell me everything, absolutely everything. We can't make any more mistakes. Lisa wiped away her tears and nodded, trying to find some hope in the desperate situation they found themselves in. She knew that if there was any chance of escaping Marco's clutches, it would be through Ethan's help. But at the same time, she was afraid that by exposing herself completely, she would end up losing his love forever. And then, over the next few hours, Lisa revealed every detail of her past with Marco. He told how they met, how they started working together on financial scams, exploiting legal loopholes and using Lisa's charm to gain victims' trust. She told how, in the end, things went wrong, and how she managed to escape while Marco stayed to face the consequences. Each word seemed to drain his strength, as if he were reliving a nightmare from which he could never truly wake up. Ethan listened silently, his face impassive as he processed every detail. I knew that, from that moment on, I could no longer trust anything I knew. The life he thought he had built with Lisa was largely based on lies and dark secrets. But despite everything, there was one thing he still knew for sure: he loved Lisa. And somehow, that truth was enough to keep him fighting, even when everything around him seemed to fall apart. When Lisa finished speaking, silence once again dominated the room. Ethan knew it was now his turn to make a decision. And the decision he made could determine their future, for better or worse. After a long moment, he finally broke the silence. "We'll figure this out," he said, with renewed determination. "But we'll do it my way. Marco wants revenge, and we're going to give it to him, but on our terms. Let's play his game, but let's make sure we're the ones calling the shots in the end." Lisa looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear. She knew things were far from resolved, but at least now, they were in this fight together. And maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to come out of this nightmare with something intact. But as they began to hatch a plan, Ethan knew that the final confrontation with Marco was quickly approaching. And when that confrontation arrived, nothing would be the same again. Ethan and Lisa spent the next few days in a kind of silent truce. The words had been spoken, the secrets revealed, but the weight of what was to come still hung over them like a storm about to break. Every move seemed calculated, every decision carefully considered. They were entering uncharted territory, and what was at stake was not just the future of their marriage, but their own lives. The tension between them was palpable, but there was also a renewed connection. For the first time in a long time, they were united in a common purpose, even if that purpose was to protect themselves from an implacable enemy. Marco was a constant shadow in their minds, and with every step they took, they knew they were getting closer to the inevitable confrontation. Ethan spent long hours in the dark of night, sitting in his favorite armchair, his face illuminated only by the dim light of the lamp next to him. In his mind, he relived every detail of Lisa's revelations, trying to find a flaw, a loophole that he could use to his advantage. The moral dilemma he faced was unbearable: should he hand Lisa over to justice or continue by her side, risking everything? Lisa, on the other hand, struggled with the growing guilt that consumed her. The initial relief at having told Ethan the truth soon turned into a new form of torture. She knew that no matter what happened, her relationship with Ethan would never be the same. He might be by her side now, but with every look, with every prolonged silence, she felt the gulf widening between them. The plan they had hatched together was simple, but risky. Ethan would use his skills as a lawyer to turn the tables on Marco. They needed to find a way to frame him, to reverse the blackmail and, finally, free themselves from his control. Lisa would be the bait, the key to luring Marco into a trap he couldn't escape. But the risk was enormous: one mistake, one hesitation, and everything could fall apart. As the days passed, the weight of this responsibility became almost unbearable. Ethan knew he was playing with fire, and with each sleepless night he spent, the fear of losing Lisa, or worse, of losing himself, intensified. He had agreed to fight for her, but at what cost? Could he still look in the mirror after all this? The line between right and wrong was becoming increasingly blurred, and the moral dilemma he faced threatened to erode what was left of his sanity. Lisa was also under constant surveillance. Every time she left the house, she felt Marco's eyes on her, like an invisible but oppressive presence. He still hadn't made any direct moves since the last time they met, but she knew it was only a matter of time. Marco's patience was not infinite, and at any moment, he could force her hand, demanding that she fulfill what he believed to be her right. One day, while Lisa was at the gallery, her phone rang. Marco's name appeared on the screen, and she felt a chill down her spine as she answered. The voice on the other end was soft, almost friendly, but there was a veiled threat in every word he spoke. "It's time, Lisa," he said bluntly. I'm tired of waiting. You know what I want, and I'm getting to the point where I'm not going to accept excuses anymore. Lisa took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Marco, please, just a little more time. I'm trying to get what you asked for, but I need you to trust me. Marco's laugh on the other end of the line was short, cold. Trust you? How did you trust me when you ran away and left me to rot in prison? No, Lisa, the trust is gone a long time ago. I'm giving you one last chance. Tomorrow night. Or I put everything on the table and let your life fall apart. The line went dead before she could respond. Lisa stood there, holding the phone, trying to process the threat she had just received. Time was running out, and now, more than ever, she and Ethan needed to be prepared for the worst. Marco wasn't bluffing, and the imminence of the final confrontation hung over them like a death sentence. When Lisa returned home that night, she found Ethan in the living room, his face tired and grim. She told him about the call, about Marco's ultimatum, and saw the determination in Ethan's eyes harden. We no longer have a choice, he said, his voice carrying a gravity that made Lisa shudder. Tomorrow night, everything will be resolved. One way or another, we will face this together. The moral dilemma was present in every word they said, in every decision they made. They knew there were no guarantees, that they could be headed straight for destruction. But they also knew there was no turning back. The confrontation was scheduled, and the next day, they would be face to face with the man who threatened to destroy their lives. As the night wore on, the silence in Ethan and Lisa's house was heavy, like the calm before a storm. They were about to cross the final line, where right and wrong were irreversibly mixed. And in doing so, they both knew that their lives would never be the same. The night arrived with unbearable tension. Ethan and Lisa were ready, but the fear of what was to come hung over them like a shadow. The plan was simple, but fraught with risk. Lisa would be the bait, luring Marco into the trap Ethan had carefully prepared. They expected Marco, confident in his superiority, to fall into the trap without realizing it. But there was a sense of uncertainty in the air, as if, at any moment, something could go terribly wrong. Lisa left the house just before dusk, her hands shaking slightly as she grabbed her car keys. She looked at Ethan, who was standing in the doorway, trying to convey a confidence they both knew was fragile. She forced a smile, knowing that after that night, nothing would be the same. Ethan stayed at home, every second that passed feeling like an eternity. He knew that Lisa was on her way to a dangerous encounter, and the thought of losing control of the situation was eating him up inside. He had taken every precaution, but there were so many variables he could predict. The only thing he could do now was wait. Lisa arrived at the agreed-upon location, the art gallery she managed. The place was empty except for the shadows of the sculptures that created ghostly shapes in the dim light. She walked in, feeling Marco's presence before she even saw him. When he finally appeared, the expression on his face was one of triumph. He believed he had complete control of the situation. "Good evening, Lisa," said Marco, with a cold smile. "It looks like we've finally reached the end of our game, doesn't it?" Lisa stood her ground, but the terror she felt was undeniable. She knew the real fight was yet to come. "Yes, Marco," he replied, his voice sounding stronger than he felt. "But you don't have to do that. We can find another solution." Marco chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Another solution?" he repeated, taking a few steps forward. "No, Lisa, we're past that point. I want what's mine, and nothing you say will change that." As Marco approached, Lisa struggled to maintain her composure. She needed to buy time, needed to wait for Ethan to make his move. But Marco was relentless, and the menacing gleam in his eyes showed he wasn't there to negotiate. "You've always been good at manipulating people," Marco continued, getting closer and closer. "But this time, it won't work. You owe me, Lisa. And now it's time to pay." He took a small recorder out of his pocket and pressed play. The room filled with the sound of an old conversation, a recorded confession from Lisa, detailing the crimes they had committed together. It was the evidence he had promised to use against her, and Lisa's heart sank when she heard her own voice, bringing back memories she would rather forget. "I can finish you right now," said Marco, putting the recorder back in his pocket. "And no one will ever know what happened here." Before Lisa could respond, the gallery's lights suddenly went out, plunging the place into darkness. The sound of quick footsteps echoed through the room, and Marco turned sharply, trying to identify the source. Ethan emerged from the shadows, advancing on Marco with fierce determination. In one swift movement, he managed to immobilize the man, twisting his arm behind his back. The surprise on Marco's face was evident, but he was not someone who gave up easily. A desperate struggle ensued, with both trying to gain the upper hand. The sound of heavy breathing and the clash of bodies resonated through the space as Lisa watched, paralyzed by fear. At the height of the fight, Marco managed to free himself and, in a desperate movement, pulled out a knife he had hidden. He advanced on Ethan, the blade glowing in the darkness. But before she could achieve her goal, Lisa took action. On impulse, she grabbed one of the heavy metal sculptures and hit Marco with all the force she could muster. The impact was devastating. Marco fell to the ground, the knife slipping from his hand as his consciousness faded. The room was silent except for the sound of Lisa and Ethan's labored breathing. They stood there, still, absorbing what had just happened. Marco was down, unconscious, maybe dead. Lisa looked at the bloody sculpture in her hands and dropped it, the metal clanging against the floor with a hollow sound. Ethan approached slowly, his eyes fixed on Marco's body. The moral dilemma that had haunted them throughout that journey had culminated in a single moment of brutal violence. Ethan knew that no matter what they did now, their lives were irrevocably changed. "What are we going to do?" Lisa asked, her voice weak and shaky. Ethan looked at her, realizing how much they had both lost in this battle against the shadows of the past. "Let's get this over with," he replied, his voice firm. "We need to call the police. We can't run away anymore." Lisa nodded, knowing that she was finally willing to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how dire they were. They had survived the confrontation, but the cost was too high. The love that had brought them together was now stained by violence and lies, and there was no going back to the way they were before. Ethan picked up the phone, dialed the number and waited. The ringing sound echoed through the gallery, until a voice answered on the other end of the line. He explained what had happened, aware that that call was the end of one part of their lives and the beginning of another, uncertain and full of challenges. When the police arrived, Marco was still alive but seriously injured. He was taken into custody, and the evidence he was keeping was finally revealed. Lisa turned herself in, knowing she would face the full weight of the law, but also certain that, alongside Ethan, she could begin to rebuild something new, even if it was on the ruins of what they had lost. At the end of that night, the gallery was empty and silent. Ethan and Lisa stood side by side, watching as the police car drove away. The scars from the past were there, but for the first time in a long time, they felt like they could begin to heal. The road ahead would be difficult, but they were willing to face it together, no matter what came next. What remained was a transformed love, marked by pain, but still alive. And perhaps that was the only consolation they needed.